Welcome to the Center for Architecture. My name is Joe Aliotta. I'm the AIA New York Chapter President and a Principal with Swanky Hayden Connell Architects. This evening we gather 16 days following Superstorm Sandy to consider what is the role of design in protecting our city against climate change. This storm has turned many people's lives upside down as a result. We must join forces as a design community to consider responses that bring resilience against future disasters. On behalf of the AIA New York Chapter and Center for Architecture Foundation, this evening, we hope that you are spared from Sandy's fury and have resumed normal life with minimal disruption. To those who have been hard hit by this disaster, please know that you are in all our thoughts. On a personal note, the image on the screen behind me is where I live on Staten Island, about 1,000 feet from the water's edge. What you see is the debris left from the storm surge after receded the next day. This time, I was fortunate, with the surge stopping within 100 feet of my home with no damage. Next time, anyone knows. Not as fortunate are my neighbors some who lost their lives, many in the path of destruction caused by Sandy. So forgive me if I'm responding to this disaster in an up-close and personal way. As we take immediate action to assist those in need, we thank you for your contributions made at the door this evening and ask that you consider making further contributions to the relief efforts this evening. There are donation forms at your chairs that the Center for Architecture staff will be collecting at the end of the program. Donations tonight will be sent to the Mayor's Fund to advance New York City. Our response to recovery effort has taken shape in a number of ways. The AIA New York Design for Risk and Reconstruction Committee has gathered the names of over 300 architects to serve as volunteers. The first opportunity for service will most likely be on-the-ground neighborhood assessment organized in conjunction with New York City Department of City Planning. Training sessions are in the works. We will continue to send out emails as more information is available. With so many offices damaged by the storm, the AIA New York chapter has put together a program called Members Helping Members. Initiative has sought to connect those in need of workspace with those who have available desks. The AIA staff has called nearly 700 members in affected areas to assess their needs. If there's anyone here who has a need, please see one of the staff members. If you have desks that you would like to help out a member, please do so. This coming Saturday evening, November 17th, we will open with the annual Arch Schools exhibition of student work from 14 area architecture schools, with the annual Dean's Roundtable from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. The roundtable topic changes each year. This Saturday's program will focus on the responsibilities of architectural schools to address how design can protect the environment against climate change. The chapter thanks the AIA New York Design for Risk and Reconstruction Committee, and especially its co-chairs, Lance J. Brown, FAIA, and Ilya Azaroff, AIA, for their tremendous efforts in the response to this disaster, and their continuing efforts to work with government officials. And now please let me welcome Ilya Azaroff, AIA, co-chair of the AIA New York Design for Risk Reconstruction Committee, to introduce the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. It's good to see you all here this evening, all safe and dry. The energy that Joe spoke about and the outpouring from our members once we gave out the call, it was on the average of one person signing up per minute. And within that first 24 hours, we had so many people pouring out there or volunteering to be part of this. So this evening, my role is very simple. I'm going to get out of the way. And the one thing that I do want to say is that as Joe alluded to, we will continue our efforts to connect with all the city planning officials, local agencies, neighborhoods, allied professionals, to begin to answer some of the questions that may be brought forth by this panel this evening. All of you will be informed and hopefully be part of the solution. The one thing that we cannot do is quickly forget that this has just happened. And more often than not, if you do not live in one of these neighborhoods, it quickly goes by the wayside. We will continue those efforts to help in the recovery and the long-term rebuilding. We are already forgetting that Sandy did not just hit here. Of course, it hit New Jersey, but 69 people died in Cuba on its way up here. And so we have just joined a group of nations that experience this much more often than our region does. And in looking forward, you must realize that when something like that hits one of those nations, how unfortunate it is, they adjust to their new normal. In our case, we can see recovery on the horizon because we're a relatively wealthy nation, we're resilient, and we have built-in resiliencies. We must do better. So going forward as an organization and as a player in forming what our future is, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about what we want that new normal to be. It's certainly going to be better than what it was before Sandy in terms of the built environment, the neighborhoods, and what resilience means to each of us. So without further ado, I want to bring up or introduce our panelists this evening, many of whom I know from working with over the past couple of weeks or the past couple of years. This evening we have Cynthia Barton. She's the Housing Recovery Planning Manager at the Office of Emergency Management. Howard Slatkin, he's the Director of Sustainability and Deputy Director of Strategic Planning for the New York City Department of City Planning. Dr. Klaus Jacob, he's a geophysicist and a dear friend, and I'm glad to see you here this evening. He teaches disaster risk management at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Stephen Cassell, AIA Principal at ARO. Donna Walcavage. Did I say that correctly?
Pretty close.
Pretty close. I have one of those strange names, and so I'm always sensitive to it. FASLA, and is a landscape architect and urban designer. And Robert Rogers, FAIA, from Rogers Marble Architects, who was affected by the storm, lost power, and was down for quite some time. And our moderator this evening is Michael Kimmelman, architecture critic at the New York Times. And if I could bring Michael up to begin, that would be great. Thank you, folks. Thanks for coming.
Thanks very much. So I'll try to be brief in my remarks, and then I'll make sure the rest of us are as well, and so we can get to the conversation and then to your questions afterwards. I'm very much looking forward to this myself because I very much want to hear what all of the panelists have to say, and you as well. I spent the last couple of weeks since Sandy talking to lots of people to try to inform myself about what the issues are and what the way forward might be. And I just want to say a couple quick things perhaps as a kind of provocation or something to pick up later. And that is, it seemed to me in talking to lots of different people that there is a certain consensus. It's a rough consensus, but it has to do with steps that make some sense in the long run. And some of them are no doubt obvious to you too. This is an existential crisis for New York. It's a moment, not just New York, but the region. But I think it's an existential crisis probably in two senses. I should just say that, we can look at solutions and see what some of them are. Sea gates, soft and hard edges, louvers on subways, new regulations and zoning codes to deal with electrical equipment in basements, maybe porous streets with catchment basins, and waterproof vaults for equipment under streets. These kinds of things seem to me to be in the conversation now, and the one thing I have gathered from talking to lots of people is that we need to think as not in terms of either or, not as in terms of solutions that might be politically expedient, big shiny objects in the middle of the Verrazano Straits that will be politically useful in running for office, but in terms of many things. None of these solutions alone are the answer. Many of them combined may well be. But I wanted to say something else, and then I'll shut up. I don't think personally that the costs of this are necessarily a problem. We can do cost-benefit analyses, and we probably will and should. And you can already see from the billions we've spent that whatever this costs is going to be worthwhile in the long run. And it doesn't involve the Manhattan Project, much as my friend Bill Keller wrote rather brilliantly the other day, because it's not about inventing something new, right? It's not that we don't have solutions that seem at hand. We don't have to invent the atomic bomb. But we do seem to need to do something, and this is the other existential part that strikes me. We do need to face the fact that this is a challenge, I think, to our democracy as well. That is the way our democracy works. I think, and here let me bring up something that's probably the most sensitive part of this. I think part of this is going to be answering what parts of this city in the future are necessary to change and salvage and develop, what parts may be unsalvageable, and what, you know, the Australians have a phrase about redesign. I forgot all of them, redesign, but part of it is relocate. And I think we need to be able to have a conversation about which parts of the city we wish to return to normal, which cannot. And we may need to exercise authority to bring together the different entities and agencies and politicians and communities, which are difficult to do even in normal circumstances. The Army Corps of Engineers, the DEC, all the city agencies, the MTA, the Port Authority, you can list them yourself, as well as communities in not just talking about solutions, but coming up with them. So I hope we can talk a little bit today, not just about what we need to do in the short term and what architects can do in terms of design, but also how we wish to conceive this in stepping forward in terms of our future and our democracy. So that's it for me, and let me turn this over first to Cynthia. Sorry.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks everyone for being here. I just wanted to introduce myself as the Housing Recovery Plan Manager at the New York City Office of Emergency Management, and to explain a little bit about what that means and what my job was like before 2 weeks ago and what it is like now. So I started working at OEM because of a design competition that was actually called What If New York City, and it was focused around the idea of what if New York City gets hit by a really big hurricane, and how would we provide housing for people. And so it was through the design competition, actually, the housing recovery, the impetus for a kind of housing recovery program that was sort of the genesis for the beginning of looking at housing recovery as a part of emergency management. And so the design and the vision that was created through the original competition was the thing that opened up the discussion on the regulatory and the policy issues that really are the heart of the matter that we're looking at now. And I also wanted to say that a big part of my work has been with a Homeland Security grant that is called the Regional Catastrophic Preparedness Grant Program. And this is really actually a big innovative program for Homeland Security, because it's the first time that it's funding the development of plans that cross state boundaries, and also the first time that it's funding plans that address natural disaster. And I think that, Michael was saying that this is a challenge to our democracy, and it's also a huge challenge to our bureaucracy. And I think we really are living at a watershed moment in sort of our bureaucratic infrastructure where we have the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, devising programs that are really, the FEMA mantra right now is whole community. And the focus for FEMA is to address, the effects of the extreme events of climate change. And also, then we have at HUD Sustainable Communities Program, which is basically developing livable cities with green infrastructure and public transit and all the things that we think about when we think about sustainable cities. And so there is this alignment at the federal level between FEMA and between HUD, and I think also the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy, all these alignments. And, the reason that actually the design competition for post-disaster housing in New York City got started was because FEMA was not looking at how do you provide housing in urban areas. And with these programs that are coming together from FEMA and from HUD now, the urban issues are really, or the particular challenges of living in cities are still something that the federal government turns to us and says, well, you do that best, tell us what to do. And so I do think that this is a moment where we have a lot of authority and power to bring about a lot of changes that we would like to see. And I do think that engaging the public sector with nonprofits and private sector organizations, as a lot of us have seen coming together over the past week. I think that that's something that this is an opportunity to figure out how to actually do that best, and how to create structures that sustain that kind of collaboration that we need after a disaster throughout daily life in the city. And I think with that, I'm going to just turn it over to Howard, who I have actually worked with as the Department of City Planning on post-disaster urban neighborhood design guidelines. Go ahead. And if you'd like to see more about any of these projects, I'm happy to send info, so please just send me an email.
Thanks, Cynthia, and thank you to Ilya and to Lance and the committee for convening this whole series of discussions, to Joe and to AIA for putting this forum together, and to everybody for coming out tonight. 2 months ago, just 2 months and a couple of days ago, I was here in the same room with colleagues here presenting about the extensive work that city planning and the mayor's office has been doing on climate resilience and building the city's climate resilience, identifying strategies for improving the resilience of our buildings and our infrastructure. I'm glad to be back here to continue that discussion, but obviously none of us is glad about the circumstances under which we're continuing this discussion. At that previous meeting, we described several of the projects that are underway between city planning and the mayor's office, including activities through the funded through the HUD Sustainable Communities regional planning grant program that I think Cynthia alluded to. Efforts to improve the flood resilience of our buildings in a way that not only provides protection, but also reinforces and supports the vitality of our community's character. And also efforts to reduce the vulnerabilities of our critical infrastructure around the city. Obviously, the storm has made all this work all the more relevant and all the more urgent to everyone here. Tonight, what I'd like to do is just speak on a few things. Obviously the city is, many people here and many people in city government are still in the process of the recovery, and we're all in the process of learning more about precisely what happened during the storm and why, and examining those facts. But tonight, what I'd like to talk about is framing a few of the issues and identifying a few of, I think, the early lessons that are important to us with respect to how we plan and design for our communities near the water. First, one of the lessons is that new buildings are by and large more resilient to flooding than old buildings. There's a rather straightforward reason for this. We obviously know a lot more today than we knew a century ago about flood risks and how to design and engineer for those risks. The first flood maps, the first FEMA flood maps for New York City went into effect in 1983. And since then, building code has required new and substantially improved renovated buildings in the FEMA flood zone to adhere to these FEMA floodproofing standards. Buildings that were built prior to 1983, really were not required to adhere to those floodproofing standards. The initial information that we have following the storm confirms that our suspicion that new buildings are on the whole more resilient, while there are many older buildings around the city that suffered flooding damage. Obviously, we know about many of those. Places like the East River shoreline in Brooklyn and Queens, new construction was able to weather the storm well, based on the feedback we've received from property owners in those areas. These are buildings that were built to or in exceedance of the FEMA floodproofing standards. In Staten Island and in the Rockaways, we also saw in areas where there was destruction, we also saw that there were newer buildings that fared better than older buildings. And there's an important lesson in this as we think forward towards repairing and renewing our housing stock and our other buildings. We also know that there are some locations, like in Lower Manhattan, where flooding exceeded the elevations that were anticipated and designated on the current FEMA flood maps. Between these pieces of information, there are two key initiatives that are identified in Plan YC that are really important to pay attention to here. One is incorporating a requirement for freeboard, which is an additional margin of safety for flood protection into building codes, elevating buildings by 1 or more feet beyond what would otherwise be required in code, and working with FEMA to update their official flood maps. The city some time ago supplied FEMA with new high-resolution digital elevation data to enable this update process to happen. These are processes that were already underway before the storm hit and are surely processes that we're going to be wanting to accelerate today. Now, waterfront development for many people brings to mind these newly redeveloping areas around the city in Williamsburg or Long Island City. Those are obviously key portions of our waterfront and of our initiatives in the past decade, but there's actually a long history of building and living near the water in New York City. This is not a new phenomenon. About 80% of the buildings and the residential units in the FEMA 1% flood zone were built prior to 1983 when those first flood maps were released. Over 90% of those buildings were built before 2002, buildings and units. This, in part, highlights the important role that new development can play in the waterfront in terms of reducing exposure to coastal flood risks. New development frequently replaces older buildings or often, in many locations, sites with crumbling waterfront infrastructure, and can be an important source of the investment that's necessary to reduce coastal vulnerabilities to flooding. But these numbers also highlight the share of buildings that were built that were not built with floodproofing in mind, and the importance of finding other ways to address flood resilience. These include a wide variety of strategies, including the retrofitting of existing buildings and examining other protections that go beyond the scale of the individual building. At the larger scale, we certainly need to explore the full range of strategies that I think Michael alluded to, identify which of those are going to be effective, cost-effective, equitable strategies. And keep in mind, sort of backing out for a moment to a regional context, that strategies that are cost-effective in one environment may not be cost-effective in another. We kind of have a gradient. While this storm was a regional storm, the exposures that we're talking about exist all over the eastern seaboard. Certainly, as was mentioned in the Caribbean, there are these exposures all over the place. And the types of strategies that make sense in one environment may or may not make sense in another. Strategies of retreat, for instance, picking up neighborhoods and populations and moving them away from the water are much more likely to make sense in a undeveloped or low development context than in a highly development context, just from a cost effectiveness point of view. In areas that are densely built up around large investments in fixed infrastructure, those strategies are much less likely to be cost effective. For instance, we know that we can't pick up the subway system and replicate it somewhere else. So we know that we have large investments in our communities already that we've committed to that are really important to sustaining the growth and the continuation and growth of our communities. Prior to the storm, as we talked about a couple of months ago here, city planning had already begun an effort to catalog the range of potentially applicable coastal protection strategies and how they might be applicable to New York City's diverse 520 miles of waterfront. The city had already reached out, also prior to the storm, to the Army Corps about commencing the type of extensive engineering study that's necessary to help answer some of these questions about feasibility, cost effectiveness, and would also be the prerequisite for undertaking any project of that nature. But even if a large-scale barrier system is part of the solution, it would take many years before such a system could be built. And we have real issues in the near term. We still need to find ways to make the key investments to protect our critical infrastructure, our subways, our tunnels, the electric grid, the steam system, and all the systems that we have obviously paid so much attention to in the past several weeks. I know my fellow panelists here are going to have their own thoughts and ideas to contribute to this, and I think I really want to reemphasize what I think many people are going to say tonight, that dialogue about this and the forum that the AIA has been able to provide here are really going to be important to navigating these issues as we all move forward. Thanks.
Should I just push the button here to get to the next? Okay. Okay, I'm Klaus Jacob, and I want to make only a few points, and I have some illustrations for that purpose. When we reconstruct, we shouldn't reconstruct, we should prostruct. We have to look forward, not backwards. This gives you the map in red, what is the official FEMA flood zone. It's only part of New York City, it's not the entire one. And in brown, ochre, orange, is the 100-year flood zone with a 2-foot freeboard edit. So you see how the flood zone moves inland with sea level rise. So that is sea level rise plus keeping all the storms likelihood the same. There's an additional component that's not accounted for here, that the storm frequency itself may go up at a given level. And the green areas are the ones with a 4-foot sea level rise according to the so-called rapid ice melt scenario, which the NPCC, which is an organization that the mayor installed, which is a scientific advisory committee, the New York City Panel on Climate Change. If you use that model, then you see where roughly by the year 2080s, the 100-year flood zone will have moved. So it's not enough that we only look at Sandy right now. We have to look farther inland and act accordingly. Now that is the lateral mapped extent. Now here comes the real bad message. It's this table, and I'm sorry to bother you with numbers, but sometimes numbers count. Let's just look at the 100-year flood zone. These are the heights with that rapid ice melt scenario that will bring you the flood height from 8.6 with a particular datum, but that's technical stuff, where that goes up. But what's really bothersome, if I stay at that 8.6 foot, and let's say that is one of the subway entrances that flooded, okay? And I ask myself, what's the recurrence period that this subway entrance will flood prior to sea level 2000, the year 2020, 2050, 2080. The recurrence period goes down from 100 years to roughly 50 years, to roughly 12 years, to roughly 2 years. And that's the real bad message. That means essentially that on a nice, sunny, wind-still day in the year 2100, that subway entrance will flood practically annually. That's the message. No storm on top, just a little wind. Now you have storms like Irene, like Sandy on top of it. Okay? So, it's not just the height that we have to think about. In terms of economy, what it means, whether you can, a world financial center, where the subway gets shut down every few years, that's not sustainable. So clearly we have to do something. This just shows you how urgent it is that we have to think about it, and not just for the next 20 years. Presumably, we want to have a New York City in 50 and 100 years, and hopefully in 500 years. God forbid to think what sea level rise will be in 500 years. And a year ago at the same place I showed that, but I won't bother you with you. So, that was the message in terms of recurrence period. Now let me just summarize here what my thinking was, and this was actually prepared for another talk before Sandy arrived. My points are that we have to make time-dependent benefit cost risk analysis. And when I say time-dependent, then I mean if we think about barriers, or if we think about a sewage treatment plant, or if we think about the subway system that have presumably lifetimes of 50, 100, 150 years, 200 years, then we have to plan different than for a little ramshackle backyard shed. So it has to be time dependent on the importance and the expected meaningful life cycle of that structure. You don't have to invest anything for the 200 years. You may build it adaptable, but you have to think adaptable. Don't just fix it for the next 50 years. Yes, you may want to fix it only for the next 50 years, but in such a way that future generations don't get punished with what we're doing now. Make it adaptable. The adaptation has to be adaptable. Next point here is, I think we should include options with and without barriers. You know, I have been portrayed as a barrier skeptic, and I am still a barrier skeptic, but not in the sense that I exclude barriers as a meaningful option. But let me quickly repeat why I'm a skeptic. I'm a skeptic because I look at New Orleans. They had protection, right? And then they ended up with 8 or 10 feet of water in their city. Now, New York City is not New Orleans, but it has portions of it that are New Orleans. And one of the portions is the subway system. It's below sea level, for the most part. So, yes, we need defenses. Do we need the barriers for defending them? The latest numbers that just came out today from a preliminary report that Joe and Arts from the Netherlands was commissioned by the city to do. The report is due next year. But he came out with a preliminary estimate of $23 billion that really had a sticker shock on the establishment in the city. I think that's highly optimistic. I think that's the down payment of the big dick in Boston, okay? When they thought it cost $2 or $3 billion, and I think they ended up with $14 billion. So I think that would be cheap if we could do it for $23 billion. That's 3 barriers and some levee and dike systems on the side, because it doesn't make point to put barriers in the Verrazano Bridge and it comes through the back door where you don't have levee and pumping systems and all that stuff. So it has to be thought through in a systemic way. But still, with sea level rise having currently no upper limit, you can build barriers with a given foundation width only to up to a certain height. And then beyond, they have great difficulty growing unless you widen the base for it. There are other problems. There are people that are outside the barriers and they get actually a negative feedback from the existence of the barriers. There are people that are not at all near the barriers. So what about them? Okay. So Long Island, New Jersey, and so on. And it will have to be a system that involves both New Jersey and New York. We're sitting in one boat. Okay. So I'm for barriers to be at least considered, but with what I call an exit strategy. Namely, when sea level rise makes those barriers dysfunctional or unreliable, we have to have something done behind the barrier, and then we can say goodbye to the barriers because we have done it behind the barriers. If that's the case, then the question is, what do we need the barriers for if we have to do it behind the barriers? Okay. I still think, when you think very carefully, there's a place for barriers potentially. I'm not yet entirely sold on. Enough about the barrier issue. Based on outcome of that benefit-cost analysis, develop a regional sea level rise adaptation policy strategy that you can translate into your regulations, laws, environmental reviews, the whole smorgasbord of bureaucratic decisions that have to be in place and regulations so the architects can follow them and the engineers can follow them. You have to have a regional master plan. This involves Connecticut, New York, New Jersey. It's a regional issue, not just a city issue. Don't forget, sea level rise and tides go past my house, and I had 2 feet of water in my house. I'm not in New York City, I'm in Rockland County on the Hudson. The tides went up all the way to the Federal Dam in Troy. Luckily, even past Albany, which needs to take notice of that. So, we have to have a regional plan, with or without barriers, but we have to have in some areas guaranteed, and I have to feel, even behind the barriers, a managed retreat plan from the lower elevations. A managed retreat plan. Yeah, that gets financed and has sound regulations in place. There will be losers and there will be winners. The losers are near the water at low elevation. The winners are the folks around Central Park at high elevation in Brooklyn Heights, and you name it, whatever heights. The Dutch have invested quite a bit already into floating city blocks that go up and down with the water. I think we should seriously think and put some of our infrastructure perhaps even on floating systems for those where that's feasible. I wouldn't think it would be too bad if some of the utilities have their transformers go up and down with the tides instead of being inundated by the tides. Anyway, there are all sorts of solutions. All I'm saying is we have to think outside the box. Incorporate the climate change information like the one I provided you in a probabilistic risk estimate for various time horizons. You cannot do this deterministic. I know regulations and rules have a deterministic character, and you can't, each architect, make a probabilistic assessment. So there have to be rules, but they need to be based on probabilistic and have to do with lifetime and exposure time and all that without going into the clear details. Let me have one last point, namely, while all this wonderful discussion is going on, and I'm having confidence that New York City is in a pretty good place right now, having had all the ducks lined up before Sandy came along in thinking about those problems. We have to have operational interim plans, cheap solutions, interim solutions. Inflatable plugs that you can stick into tunnels and blow them up, like Virginia Tech has proposed since 10 years ago. So our tunnels don't flood, our subway entrances don't flood. You don't even need gates for that. Be smart, cheap in the interim, and durable in the long run. And with that, I would say, timing makes a difference.
That's sort of hard to follow. I wanted to talk about a project that we did a couple years ago, 2010, in collaboration with D-Land Studio for the Rising Currents exhibition at MoMA that looked at Lower Manhattan and looked at some of the issues that are on the table now. And really that project started, and before that was preceded by a 2-year study that we worked on. The study was led by Guy Nordenson and funded by the La Trobe Foundation, looking at the effects of climate change within the greater New York harbor. And really the premise of the study was looking at soft infrastructure solutions. And maybe in some ways one of the things that one of the basic things is that we have to sort of reconceive of our relationship with water in terms of not thinking of this hard fixed boundary that doesn't change. It's a boundary that's fungible and can move over time in different directions. And that, this exhibition for Rising Currents, D-Land and ARO really, and this was an 8-week sort of conceptual study of what will happen in Lower Manhattan. How do you respond in 100 years? How do you look at this? And what we were trying to do is say, conceptually, can we reframe how the city engages the idea of water? What is the relationship of the city of water and to water? And can you start to think about a different paradigm of how you look at maybe an ecological infrastructure that engages and works in parallel with the city's existing infrastructure. This was one of the images from the thing. This was in Metro New York the other day. I'm just so shocked that the conversation has come this quickly. Sadly shocked, honestly. Where, this is a pretty image and it's a Photoshop image, but really what we wanted to do and what I want to talk about is really starting to look at more holistic systems. And I think that's what we came away with after working on this project, is saying, while there are a lot of different solutions to this, we should also pull back and look at it holistically. And how can these systems relate to each other and relate to the city, and how can they evolve over time? And I think one of the things about the soft infrastructure solutions are you don't have to, and as opposed to a barrier, and maybe barriers are correct in some instances, not correct. I think a lot of study will have to go into that. But in essence, a barrier you could think of as a binary solution. It's working or it's not working. You're building to a certain height and a certain probability. And we don't know what that is over the next 100 years or 50 years. We can know it could be worse and it could be better, but in essence, can you come up with solutions that you can layer on and add to over time? And so we were looking at a two-part system and a series of a porous, basically green street system within the area that would flood in a worst case, or maybe not worst case, situation of an 18 to 24 foot high storm surge. And this was a number, and this is, again, we were looking at a 100-year time span, and the 18 to 24 is high tide versus low tide. And so that the area of the blue streets is the area that's flooded, which is around 61% of lower Manhattan. So that was an extreme. This was also a didactic study that we're putting forward, how to sort of push these ideas to sort of the logical extension of what they are. And really what we were proposing is saying, can you take a street system that is, and start to rationalize it and looking at it in different ways. One, taking the infrastructure and rationalizing it into waterproof vaults, maybe below the sidewalks, maybe dry systems versus wet systems. And then rebuilding the street beds, and this is one of multiple images, that some of the streets would be porous, in essence would absorb water, and we were increasing the amount of absorptive area. We were looking at a 650-acre catchment area. We were trying to increase it to around 80 acres of both green space and absorptive area. And we really had three types of streets. One was level 1 that was just absorbed water with engineered soil beneath it. The other was a level 2 street that were basically channels below the street that diverted water back out to the edge of the island. And then level 3 were streets that were parallel to the shore, right in from the shore, that had a more robust system for dealing with water. At the same time, around the edge of the city, we were proposing putting a system of saltwater and freshwater wetlands, and that really served two purposes. One was to absorb some of the force of the storm surge, and basically there's energy associated with that storm surge. And specifically, when we were working on the original Latrobe work, specifically at the tip of the island, where we were proposing a series of barrier islands to help absorb some of that force. And so, in essence, the saltwater and freshwater wetlands, would get mangled. The destruction of that, in essence, helps absorb some of that energy. It doesn't stop the water from going in. It's dealing with energy of the storm surge. At the same time, it's also to process water that's going back out. And while we were looking at this, because in essence what we were saying is we're proposing new ecological infrastructure in some ways that's working in parallel to the existing city infrastructure that also was dealing with rainwater and CSO, the problems of CSOs and sort of the overflows of the sewer system at the same time. So can this basically be a system that dealt with the management of water? And on the edge, while the morphology, this is on the East River, where the morphology would change as you move around the island, depending on how the bathymetry worked and how the water moved in those specific areas. In essence, it's really looking at a much more graduated edge along the edge of the water. And really, I think fundamentally what we're saying is it's time to move, in some ways, to sort of reframe how we engage the water, both perceptually and also on maybe a optimistic note, saying that, in essence, in dealing with some of these problems, can you look at this infrastructure as a way to then further the qualities of the city? Is it not just building defensively, but are there ways to transform your experience within the city over time? the one other interesting thing, and I'll pass it on to Donna after this, is the area that we were looking in flooding, and if you look at the history of Lower Manhattan, is really the area that goes to the original outline of the island. And so yeah, you don't completely agree, but it's roughly the island has progressively grown larger with landfill over a certain number of years. And so the topography, and if you look at some of the maps, there's some alignment between that. And so there's sort of an interesting reframing that no matter how much we put the 1811 Commissioner's Grid across the city, some of the topography that we sort of obliterated still has a strong impact within what's here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Donna, and thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I was thinking this morning about how many presentations that we've been to, many of them in this room on the effects of climate change. Makes a big difference. Okay. I use it. Oh, maybe I can gain some weight now. I'm taller. Well, I was thinking this morning about how many presentations we've been to in the last years on the effects of climate change and what we're going to do about it. Many of them in this room, and I remember Klaus Jacobs' full presentation just, I think, last year to the American Society of Landscape Architects group on climate change. So I then remembered Gary Null. Gary Null had a program on one of the public radio stations on healthy living, focused on what we used to call health food, in my memory. And he talked about doing lectures in the city, and he would, one time, the whole front area of the room was taking copious notes and asking detailed questions. He was really thrilled that people were finally getting the whole idea of eating healthy food. And then he packed up and left and walked back to the subway. And as he was passing the McDonald's, all of those people were sitting there eating Big Macs, French fries, and Cokes. So I thought we were kind of in denial about the urgency of climate change up till now. And I felt that Klaus Jacobs probably felt a lot like Gary Null did at that moment. So I think we are moving to rational planning. I've worked with Howard, and I know people with city planning and their attitudes towards sustainability. I think sometimes when we try to implement these ideas on projects, because so many of us, we've had the ideas, we just haven't been able to put them in place, that we get more resistance. Stephen did a wonderful job. His slides illustrated probably in a lot of ways what we should be doing when we're looking at both short-term and long-term ideas for the waterfront. And Michael's point about having to move people away from places that just can't continue to be inhabited as the floodwaters rise. Having green parks that can absorb the water is great, and if we can work on ways that incrementally people can move upland and have more density in the center with lots of green space around it, this might work over the century that Dr. Jacobs is talking about. So I think we know what to do, we just haven't done it. The issues are very complex and require a lot of collaboration between various disciplines. When I told someone in my office I was doing this tonight, she's a restoration ecologist, she started jumping up and down and told me, "You have to tell them not to build that wall." Because the entire estuary of New York is a very complex system. There is, it's an area where in the tens of thousands of years since the glacier receded, the environment, the flora and the fauna, the whole ecology of the system is based on this very, this dance of water, salty water and fresh water mixing, going all the way up as, was it you who said this, Dr. Jacobs, the water went all the way up to Albany, to the Troy Dam, and it comes and goes every year. The salt line goes up in the winter and comes down as the floodwaters in the spring bring more fresh water into the system. So Karen's point was that if this wall is built, you're going to prevent the mixing of the water, you're going to change that composition, and it could kill the whole environment. So we need input from a lot of different places. They could be, we need to mix expertise to get at the complexity of the problem. And also, this is a regional system. I was doing a project on Long Island Sound, and I know we can't end at political boundaries. Nature doesn't respect them. But when I was doing some research on the history of Long Island Sound, I realized that the watershed goes up to Quebec. So if you add the rest of our watershed, it's a very, very large area. And you have to look regionally at how to solve these problems, not just in the city. We tend to want to build things in response, and sometimes construction works. This is Blackpool in England, where the ocean was really threatening to topple the boardwalk and topple the city if they didn't fix the flood wall. So instead of building a wall that was a barrier, they engineered steps that went up to the boardwalk and invited you from the boardwalk down to the ocean. But those steps are designed to break up the tidal action. But as Stephen was talking about, very often it's the soft solution that works better. And I hope that we're going out and surveying what types of systems worked best in protecting the upland and in their own survival. My guess is that the softer the system, the better it survived, unless it was really very new, as Howard and I were discussing a project we worked together on the East River. Where there is need to use vertical systems because soft systems take up a lot of space, I think we should be looking at the work that Marcia Johnson at the Park Department's done. She's a landscape architect whose focus is on the edge between water and the land. And she's done some, a couple of years ago, she had a grant to do research on how to build systems. This was on a project on the Harlem River that echo the natural systems of shorelines, but to do it vertically. And she's got 3 different pieces of construction that replace sheet pile, but she's never been able to get funding to research how well they performed, although they do seem to do a better job of wave attenuation. They should also be supporting the environment of the river as well. And then one last really scary thing is how people have become really afraid of trees. So at risk of typecasting landscape architects, I'm actually going to talk about trees a bit. Power lines were down, houses were damaged, people are even killed by trees. So many people are calling for massive tree removal. And one of my colleagues in the Boston office told us that in the town he lives in outside of Boston, the weekend before the storm, the town took out 80 trees because they were afraid they were going to do damage. It wasn't very popular, but I have since heard a lot of people talking about wanting to take out trees. My colleague, Andrew Lavallee, in my office, is responding to this by putting together an initiative calling for integrating forestry and tree planting into regional planning and integrating vegetation into regional planning. So it can be integrated with climate mitigation, stormwater management, air quality, real estate value, and energy distribution. So creating partnerships with energy suppliers, jointly funded projects through public and private sector, and also management and maintenance of the tree cover so that they don't become a danger in a storm situation. So the tens of billions of dollars that we're going to plan for massive projects is one thing, but I think we can incrementally add things into the projects we're doing by requiring that every project anywhere close to the waterfront take into account stormwater, take into account climate change, excuse me, climate change mitigation.
Good evening. Last. So one of the things I thought about putting this talk together for a few minutes tonight was just the venue, which is the Center for Architecture, and the role of designers in there, because we know that there's a huge amount of bureaucracy, policy, other kinds of issues. But what is it that we can think about as designers, both proactively and reactively to the situation? Interesting and really oddly, in a competition that was sponsored by the History Channel back in 1996 to talk about the city in 100 years, we were already beginning to look at the issue and thinking about it not just in terms of climate change and water, but one of the propositions that we thought about at the largest scale was that when the Erie Canal was finished, New York Harbor handled almost 50% of the gross domestic product of the United States. And if you think about the staggering financial capacity that has been this edge that made Manhattan and New York and New Jersey in the first place, then why can't we reimagine that edge with the same kind of serious national, regional capacity that has financial meaning, it has infrastructure, it has recreation, it has all of those things. It's a remarkable transformation that will take generations, but so did the original one as a commercial enterprise. We're going to need to deal with every conceivable scale, whether it's talking about the city as part of a major watershed system. It's also going to be when you're dealing with a project for, in this case, 700 or 800 units on the Gowanus Canal, and the inclusion of park space as a fundamental part of waterfront planning. It's begun to be part of the policy. It's also begun to be part of a design attitude that no longer is development simply the construction number of units, but it's the construction of public space. And it's the construction of public space that has performance requirements. And in this case, it has to do with the water encroachment. At a smaller scale, now beginning to talk about the sidewalk, although we have miles and miles of sidewalk in New York, in a project we did for the MTA, where we redesigned a series of subway grates that allow us to model, use the hydrological models developed by engineers in each of the areas where we were dealing with the flooding subway issues. We were able to construct subway grates that varied between 12 inches and 24 inches of height, and began to quietly and didactically tell the story of water incursion into the city as one of the next steps in our infrastructural development. Park space, which has been at the heart of economic understanding of development in New York, also needs to be at the heart of environmental understanding of New York Harbor and beyond. Working with West 8 on the master plan for Governor's Island, we actually went through long discussions about raising the level of the south portion of the island, adding yards of fill in many locations, not just, as Adrian Geophysicist insisted, for the preservation of the trees. If you want to have 100-year-old trees, you have to think about where the roots are going to be in 100 years, but also so that the island itself, if the idea is for that to support future development and to be a place that is where New York's going to be in 100 years, then you've got to be able to develop that. This is a section of the West Promenade where there's actually dual levels of the park being proposed, so that you've actually got a place for inundation and to receive the surge. And a conversation I had with West 8 just a couple hours ago, the result from Sandy confirmed almost within inches the prediction of where the concern was for the water coming into and over the island. And I want to, since I'm last, end with a proposition back to Michael and the panel, which is, you know, this is what we do, is we think about the future and we learn from the past and we look forward. And one of the things that I think is compelling here is that the climate change issues cover a staggering diversity of design thinking opportunities. The last time New York was hit with something like this, in 9/11, there's all this knee-jerk reaction in terms of security, and it was in response to a very dynamic behavioral threat. And design was really weak-kneed in being able to confront that and convince people that you could, in fact, think around that problem. But we have the benefit this time of really solid science. And it means that the program and the mission with which we start with as designers is much more fact-bound in terms of what we're able to take on and do. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Michael, who I think is going to grill us for a little while.
Yeah. So predictably, and as always, nobody paid any attention to the time limits, so we'll do the best we can to talk and then have some time for questions as well. So many things came up. It was so interesting, and so to work backwards, I was very glad that you brought up 9/11, because I was thinking that there was, after this, also a kind of this existential question, to get back to what I said in the beginning, and there was even a little bit of, you know, Robert Moses nostalgia. We need leadership, and we need, and maybe we do this time. But I agree with you. I don't know if the panelists would elaborate on this too. But that was a very highly political, and it was corrupted essentially by a political process that we cannot say does not exist this time. And I think while it's completely true that this is a much larger and in many ways an unavoidable and scientific problem, it does seem to me to be inescapable that we have a political and bureaucratic system that is at odds with the steps that need to be taken immediately and in the long term as well. I mean, let me just throw out there, I was thinking of the grid as we spoke about this, because maybe Moses is too toxic an example. But we have episodically in our history, the history of New York anyway, gone through physical transformative stages. And they have often been responsive. I think Steve and I have talked about this too. Responsive to calamities, cholera in that case, and urban congestion. And what was the grid? It was this bureaucratic, enormous bureaucratic, multi-generational effort that exercised extra power, which was opposed, actually, and quite rightly in some cases. But in any case, that extra authority, eminent domain, carried forward these projects over the objections of many of the landowners and other people. at the time who saw this as violations of their rights. So I'm sorry to bring it back to the thing, but I've just been thinking about it over and over. I think it's wonderful to talk about the things we should do, and whether barriers are good or not, and what they cost, and whether louvers over subways are Band-Aid or not. I think this is great, but I just want to throw out to the panel, really, why this time is something going to happen that's good when you have all of these agencies, all these bureaucracies? Who is going to legislate and have the authority, and what kind of authority do we create?
I'll start very briefly, which is, I think one of the things that's distinct about this happening in New York, and I think that that's something to talk about tonight too, because as a driver, because New York, Holland's had its inundations, so it's learned to be proactive. And traditionally, the United States has been much more reactive in terms of infrastructural things. And I don't mean this to be trite, but New York and the grid are about real estate. And real estate is an economic incentive in New York City like few places in the world. Only a couple are like that. And so to have this event take place where the economic drive exists to start dealing not just with a reaction and a correction, but actually an attractive one and a positive one and a multi-phase, multi-use one, I think it is the right place to experiment with that, because it's going to be driven by high-value construction, high density, desire to be at the waterfront, not retreat. It's very different from other parts of the country.
Okay, but you're practitioners. You work in different parts of in government and out of government. Tell me now, if you had to, within the next 6 months, present something that was tangible, that was going to happen, whether it was the study by the Army Corps of Engineers that is going to tell you whether barriers work, which has not happened yet, or whatever, much less the barriers themselves. How are you going to make this happen? Now, I don't want to just, I don't want to say, because you've all been talking about these things for a long time, and those conversations are very useful. But now the public is primed. So what are the steps you have to take, and how is it going to happen?
I'm not a practitioner, so I'm free from those biases. But if I would be a huge building owner downtown Manhattan, I would rip out all the building infrastructure that's in the basement, put it either on the roof, as I did in my own building, or in the 10th floor, give up the revenue from the 10th floor, and rent out the subgrade floors as garage space. And when the storm is being forecast, you take the cars out, send them somewhere, or you put gates on those garages that have to work 100%.
So, Klaus, you're obviously from Europe. Now, Howard, you tell me actually what's going to happen.
Well, I'm not sure, I can lay out exactly, but I think I can point out some of the avenues that exist. I mean, some of them are things that we've been able to, line up as agenda items already. There are city codes and regulations, and those are really driven by model codes and regulations in a lot of ways. This is something that is, New York City can do, but other places can and are doing as well. Things like building code changes that I mentioned for increased floodproofing standards, changes to zoning to accommodate that kind of additional elevation for precautionary purposes for buildings. There are, you talked about the Army Corps study. Obviously, this is, there are regional implications to this. There's a congressional role in this. We have elected officials who will be our partners in this process. This is how, the process works. That's how the system is set up. Those studies will have to be done. There'll have to be broad sort of input and participation. The city is definitely going to be actively engaged in that process to make sure that all of the appropriate options are on the table. There are other federal policies at play here, things like the federal flood insurance program, which is an important component of how the federal government sets up structures that manage risk. There's the private insurance industry as well, that all of which play an important role in steering investment in the future and encouraging the kind of precautionary steps that are important to take. Can I tell you exactly how each of those processes is going to play out? No, but there are a lot of really important and viable venues for that kind of change.
I'm sorry, we're having. So I don't want to monopolize this, but okay. So, but those systems have not worked. I mean, the very fact that they exist does not prove that they work. I mean, they don't work. And the idea of having these federal guidelines for reconstruction, when in fact maybe the guidelines need to be the reverse, that we need somebody who's going to say that we do not want reconstruction. We cannot allow rebuilding. We need to. So I'm just saying, there's so much political pressure to. I know it's a little hard for sharing this.
I can't interrupt you.
Yeah,
you're sharing a microphone.
So, but I'm just saying. I mean, I want.
You win.
No. I don't want to win before I give up, though. I mean, there we go. No, I want you to tell me whether, because I'm obviously pushing. I'm being provocative here by asking really how one can organize authority so that it actually works, as opposed to what we have.
And I'm going to not give you a complete answer to that question, but I do think, to say that these things haven't worked is, I'm not sure. There is a difference in terms of what happens, before an event like this and what happens after an event like this. And I think that no one wanted to have to wait until an event like this happened, but I think there's a real tangible. Everyone is talking here tonight about how we can't forget what the effects of this storm were, and I think that is central to the point here, that there is a moment of clarity for people who weren't paying attention to this previously. Obviously, there were many of us. This room is disproportionately filled with people who were paying attention to this. The city has been paying attention to this, but there's a much broader constituency for this right now, and I think it's really important to move forward with that.
I think that one of the issues prior to the storm has been that a lot of the ideas that practitioners have put into their design, whether they're buildings or whether they're parks or waterfront spaces, get value engineered out of the project because they're not part of the requirements. And hopefully after the storm, those things will be seen as things that are absolutely have to be part of the program for a project.
Well, I mean, I talked recently to Kurt Schwitter from Bureau Happold, and he was saying that he presents all the time, plans to developers for buildings with moving all of their equipment up and having redundancies with generators and stuff. But in the past, they've always said how much that costs, and it's $5 million, and I said, forget it. So maybe there will be some of that. But let me give you just one quick example and see who's in charge of fixing this problem. So I talked to somebody from Goldman Sachs to figure out what they did, because I figure you might as well go to the ultimate authority in the world. And I'll just mention a couple things they did. First of all, they already had redundancies up the wazoo, partly because they are regulated by many different entities, the Fed, the Bank of England, and everything else. I won't go into the almost comical backup plans they had. But suffice to say that when there were predictions of possible storm surges of 11 feet, they prepared for 15 feet and bought Jersey barriers and 10,000 sandbags. I'm not making that number up. And constructed a virtual moat around their building. And this moat existed on West Street, across the street from the Verizon switching station, which, seeing the 15-foot barrier put up and hearing the 11-foot warnings, put up 2 feet of sandbags, and of course was out of business. Who's in charge of that? I don't mean to make this on a small level. I'm just saying, this has enormous effects. So there are a lot of these ramifications which are not. The design solutions may, in some sense, be obvious, but again, the lines of authority over the MTA, over Con Ed, over Verizon, the city cannot compel Verizon, can it, to put up more sandbags or to be smarter?
It may simply be driven by insurance.
But it isn't.
Isn't? Well, it isn't now. So the question, again, this may not be correct at all, but the question, once it happens, and if the frequency is increasing of intense storms, is that going to shift one of the paradigms? And I'm not saying that's how it should happen, because I don't think it is, but I do think that will end up being one of the drivers where you won't get reimbursed for X amount.
I think they're different structures for different components here you pointed out too. I think one is you're looking at the office market. I think that the private insurance market is a big component of that. All these buildings are insured. Right. They each have policies, and someone is going to renew that policy under some terms. And I think there's obviously considerations for the private insurance industry. And there's also, you mentioned Verizon, not pointing out any specific facilities or anything like that, but there's the Public Service Commission, there's state regulators that have oversight of the utilities, of power generators and other things. And there are many of them, many of these regulatory entities, but there are levers over this this process, and there are many different players in this. So one of the things I'll point out, I haven't mentioned, that one of the city efforts to date has been the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force, where the city convened over 40 both public and private entities that are responsible for critical infrastructure. So it's not just the city and the state and the MTA in terms of public assets, but it's the utilities, the telecommunications companies that all have these pieces of critical infrastructure. And the idea was to identify vulnerabilities, identify avenues for addressing those vulnerabilities, and I think it points at the exact set of questions that you're talking about here.
Equity. One phone per table. Well, there are two things that I want to point out. First of all, we are talking a lot here about the establishment that's at the table, at the city, and so on. But think also about all the communities that were in the red, ochre, and green zones. They have no representation effectively. I mean, they do, but it's a token effort compared to the Goldman Sachs. Okay? Goldman Sachs was the only building in the dark that had light. Okay? They are very good in looking out for themselves. Exactly. Okay? But those are the people with resources and access to resources. What about all the other ones that have no access to resources? And that's where the government has to come in. I think Goldman Sachs and the likes will walk to where the least risk for them is. And if the city doesn't manage that transformation in terms of land use or city use, they will walk off Manhattan and off New York City. Okay. So where New York City really has to manage that solution is to make space for those that drive the economy, and then take care of those that have not access to those resources, and provide the workforce and the day laborers that clean the offices.
Right. I mean, this is why I mentioned Goldman Sachs. Of course, they will take care of themselves. Actually, the person I spoke to there was very interesting, because he said that many of the businesses, wealthy, big businesses downtown, have flood insurance. They have business interruption insurance. And by the way, the insurance companies do not act as a lever in this. They have their own calculations and poor calculations, I think, about. Oh, pretty good. In any case, they have not acted as a useful lever in many cases. But he said the people who are most vulnerable in Lower Manhattan are the small businesses, the mom and pop shops and others who do not have business interruption insurance, cannot continue to pay their employees for a long period of time, and as you say, need the most help. And then he said, the thing is, of course, that's about quality of life. And if the quality of life declines in Lower Manhattan, then none of the big businesses will want to stay. So that there is an investment that the public has in maintaining and protecting the small businesses as well. But let's move to the outer, away from Lower Manhattan. We've talked a little bit about what we need to do in lower, we saw the nice pictures, and and soft edges and stuff. And I was just at Brooklyn Bridge Park today, which was a good example of another sort of edge we created, which acted as a buffer. And but what are we going to? What do we saw these horrific photographs from Staten Island, and we know the Rockaways. What should be done in areas like this? Let's have an honest conversation about this.
I think if we didn't have to deal with socioeconomic issues, politics, and emotions, and we did it scientifically, rationally, we would not have people live in high-risk areas. We'd create them as the kind of park spaces that Stephen was showing. We'd allow the edge of the waterfront to move. We'd allow barrier islands to be barrier islands. But we do have to deal with all of those issues, so it makes it much more complicated than just science.
My thoughts on that, since I live in a village of 2,500 people, of which about 500 were severely affected. This is a very interesting microcosm. The problem is that many are unable to go back to what they would call home. They would take the hardship to live even in their home without power if they only could go back. Now, so there's the immediate problem of what to do with electricity, gas, and all that stuff, if the house survived at all. Now, there's an entirely different category of people where the house went off the foundation, it's not there anymore. Now, that's for you in terms solution. And then, okay, one thing at a time. So there's the other category that has enough damage in their houses where you want to make repairs so they at least can live, so they don't need the temporary housing, okay? The problem there is that the FEMA program gives only relief for existing damage and building back to essentially what it was. And then it has a separate program for mitigation, but that has a 3 times a year cycle where a community can submit a plan to do that. To give you an example, I probably will get a check in 2 weeks from FEMA to do my immediate repairs, the rewiring, and all that stuff. And then, maybe in half a year, the village, myself, and FEMA, and the state will have cooperated on how high I can raise my house. Before I couldn't, because I was hitting a zoning law where I couldn't do that higher. Now suddenly I can by the promise of the building inspector. But the money from FEMA is a different cycle than the repair cycle. Ideally, they should go together, but the bureaucracy doesn't allow this to go together.
Yeah, I wanted to ask just 1 second about this. You said before that FEMA is addressing this, and that I believe wants to, it's there to rebuild as was. Or at least that is the strategy of FEMA. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, but I mean. So I'm sorry. I should be talking to this.
I guess I shouldn't speak on behalf of FEMA, but it's not strictly true that you can only build back what there was.
Of course, I was asking. Maybe we can. Should we be rebuilding back as it was?
No.
That's the heart of the question, really, isn't it? I mean, these are conversations about recovery and my insurance and my basement, and I think with all appropriate, challenge for those that have all of those issues, the big conversation is not about pumping out your basement. The big conversation is, what the hell is that house doing there? And are you going to leave it there, or are you going to move it? Or are you going to change the shoreline in that location and raise the house? Or what, those are large scale issues. It doesn't have to do with recovery. It has to do with reimagining that community. And it's populations, its characteristics, its economics, and what drives it.
I think there are two. I think we have to consider two very important factors. So one is rebuilding and reinvigorating communities that are hard hit by this, because communities need to survive, need to endure, and I think it's really important to get investment into those communities as quickly as possible, but also to do this in a smart way. I think that we're looking at two important considerations, and we have to do this in a smart way, but also I think that if you ask people in these communities, I think, Klaus, people want to do this and get back to their homes. I think there is an important balance of considerations here, and I think we just have to be sensitive to both dimensions of it.
I wonder, I have a proposal. So as part of the Van Allen and my association with Van Allen and Environmental Defense Fund, we're just starting to work on a project for the lower Mississippi River Delta below New Orleans and starting to look at that. And it seems like, one of the problems here is, so we did the Rising Currents exhibition. That was 8 weeks. It should have been 9 months with Bureau Happold and civil engineers and a whole host of engineers and scientists and stuff to really test ideas, economists, et cetera, to really say, okay, do these ideas work or not? Can you put them out there? And one wonders, while on the one hand you have government that, if you look, Susanna Drake had this amazing map that shows the 14 jurisdictions that overlay the area that we did, that show why you can't do what we did. And so you wonder also, would it make sense to have, for $8 million, let's say, you could have 4 teams getting $1 million each to spend a year to really study this, knowing the politics and knowing the pragmatics, but also saying, can you reframe the problem in different ways? And you may come up with solutions and you may not, but I wonder whether there has to be a parallel process, but in that parallel process be much more robust than what we did for Rising Currents, so that you really can expand the analysis in a much deeper way.
Unfortunately, you got to put a lawyer on the team too, because it's the thing is the DEC, the Army Corps, those overlays, those jurisdictions that you're talking about are really. I think that's a lot of where the conversation lies, not with the insurance companies, but in terms of moving forward, making changes, thinking about it, being active in those ways. Anybody who's dealt with a waterfront project understands the complexity and the competing interests of those jurisdictions as well. And it's a very tough way to learn, but maybe Sandy is beginning to be an impetus, whether it's on the building inspector in Rockland to allow you to move your house elevation higher, but at the highest levels bureaucratically to deal with the cooperative elements of those jurisdictions to say, you're going to have to change the regulations of how you deal with waterfront development in New York City. And that's going to happen at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level. Before we even get to deal with city planning, there's many levels above that have to accept it, be confronted with it, and acknowledge that it's going to change.
Right. So I think we're coming back to the point where I wish to begin, which was, so who exercises this authority? I mean, you've described very properly correct me if I'm wrong.
I think you need a really powerful former mayor.
Well, okay. I mean, is that it? So we need a person to be invested with special powers?
You need a champion who's believable, presents the science, understands the economics, and has a commitment to the equity that will be trustworthy to deal with the socioeconomic issues that are part of the waterfront.
So you want a benign, young version of Robert Moses. You want Felix Roe.
The best form of government is a benign dictator, but it's really hard to get one. And for all of Moses's failings, there were extraordinary successes as well, and those measurements are across the barometer. And the thing is, how are we significantly have enough watchdogs? We have more watchdogs now than ever before, and are there enough that you can begin to pursue that again?
Yeah, Klaus.
To provide a counterpoint, I'm all for that. But if you have the resources, and if you don't have the resources, do the stuff on your own. Don't wait until that benevolent dictator comes about. Because
but Klaus, but fairness and the issue. Let me put it in the hardest, cruelest possible terms.
Yes.
Let's just say that people really should not live in single-family homes on a barrier island. Let's just say they really shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So these are communities. There's a class issue here as well. We're going to protect Lower Manhattan. We're not going to protect the people in the Rockaways. But this is the hardest possible political decision. They're not going to decide that on their own. Who's going to make such a decision? This sounds very Moses-like.
The community. And what you need is essentially the government provide facilities for the community to come to a consensus. Not dictating what they should do, but the community has to come to a consensus. And that's the important thing, has to live with the consequences of its consensus. If they decide they stay, fine. But then you are out on your own, except maybe life safety, but no economic safety for that.
I think as a government employee, I'm disqualified from the question about benign or other dictators, so I'll immediately recuse myself on that point. But one thing that I just by way of context, obviously we're talking about New York City, we're talking about the New York City region, but these are issues that are confronting the entire Eastern Seaboard. These are, this is, while in New York City, yeah, you're right, I'm still thinking small when I talk about the Eastern Seaboard, thinking locally. But I think, in New York City, we have tried to lead on climate resilience thinking and on sort of laying out the roadmap for what sorts of things we need to do. And, the government has done that. The individuals in the private sector and academia have done that as well. And this is an important collaboration I think needs to continue. But I think we also look at this in the broader context. There are communities all over, at least the Atlantic coast of the United States, that are confronting these same issues. And there's a set of issues that we're all going to have to address moving forward. So one dictator, I don't know if that's, I think there's a broader set of actions that we're all going to be working on.
Right. Well, I mentioned the grid earlier because that was, as it were, a group of city planners. It wasn't the same thing, although there is this issue about the limits of how one sets the limits to authority. I mean, the genius of Moses was not just that he knew how to get things done, but he knew how to consolidate his authority and to extend it so that even there were limits drawn, but he found ways around them. That's one of the issues that's here. I mean, I'm sorry to keep pressing at this kind of a point, but let's be practical about this, since we say that we have all these things in place. So I was at Brooklyn Bridge Park today, and I was looking with Michael van Valkenburg at the park, and we were talking about the fact that he had cleared this area in the pier. Yeah, of course. Okay. I just wanted to get a little help with this and then see. He cleared this area in the pier to have, and created this soft edge with the saltwater marsh and so forth, and applied to the, where this is going, of course, to the DEC estate organization in charge of the coastline and deciding environmental matters for a footbridge, a floating footbridge of 12 feet wide that would connect the piers as a convenience for people so they didn't have to walk a half a mile around. And of course the DEC said no, because it would could affect the shadows it cast, even though it's a north-south bridge, could affect the fish habitats. So I guess let me put this in another provocative way. If we can't build a footbridge between two piers that's 12 feet wide and north-south, and we're all up here saying we have all these things we got to do and maybe build sea barriers and we're going to say we've got the things in place, we've got all these people who thought this. Really? I mean, is this plausible? I mean, who's going to believe this? Because time will pass, right? And then people will sort of forget Sandy. It's going to take a few weeks. No, but I don't mean to be funny, right? Yeah.
I think that this is a discussion that has been really ongoing. I don't think we can answer it in the next 10 minutes, but the overlapping jurisdictions on the waterfront is an incredibly complex issue that doesn't always make sense. And I know, Howard, you've been at meetings run by the MWA and the waterfront committee of the APA that go on for maybe series of meetings of 8 weeks trying to work this out. It's a really complex problem, and no one wants to. There are not only overlapping jurisdictions, but different theories of the science behind shading the waterfront or whether you can fill or not.
I mean, I think you're pointing out that there's a paradigm shift that is required for a world with climate change, and we have existing regulations, existing regulatory structures, and we all are going to have to work together to adjust to address the challenges that we're facing. I think that's evident.
So, Cynthia, I'm sorry. You say, and then I'm sorry, I've been well, I'll open it up for questions.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I can see that decision being made by one agency working by itself in its own office building. And, you know, and that's sort of business as usual. But I think now, you know, my office, which usually has about 180 people from just from OEM, now has about 350 people in it. From all kinds of different agencies, and if you can get the people who are involved in that decision to sit down around a table and solve a problem in 6 hours, sometimes it can happen. And I think that kind of straightforward collaboration is really important.
So I'm sorry, should we open it up for questions?
Prerogative and ask the first question. Yeah. I'm going to do it from a homeowner's perspective, not as part of the AIA. You know, I always watch the TV about in New Jersey, all the homes that are near the rivers that overflow, and they keep rebuilding. They keep saying, we're going to rebuild, we're going to rebuild. It really is an economic issue. If you are in Zone A and you own a home, and FEMA's going to come in and do the repairs for those homes that are in green tag or yellow tag, they're going to stay, and they may put up for sale signs 6 months from now, and maybe they'll get some sold and leave. Maybe they won't, but they'll keep staying. So in order for something to happen drastically, like deciding maybe we shouldn't build there, or maybe those houses shouldn't be there, then someone like the federal government may have to actually buy them and do something programmatically, because it's an economic issue. Those people will continue rebuilding and rebuilding unless they can find, I won't say a sucker to buy from them, but that's exactly what will have to happen.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. I know that, you know, that's in communities that have had repetitive loss, and, you know, there are many of them around the United States, whether it's riverine flooding or other types of events. You know, FEMA has been attuned to this issue because obviously it's a risk management issue for them. And I know that the recent reauthorization of the federal flood insurance program, or the National Flood Insurance Program, gave FEMA greater latitude to address areas of repetitive loss, to adjust their premiums. You know, this is one of the steps in that process. Obviously, the federal government plays a huge role in insurance, in disaster aid and reconstruction. So,
yeah. I also think that you know, Adrian Meneby is here. He's now with the Trust for Public Land, and the trust has a model for purchasing land to be held in trust as parks and as environmentally sensitive space. So that is another possible way to do it. I don't know, Adrian.
Adrian,
can I quickly answer something with respect to that? Congress passed a law, I think it was in 2003, I think it's called the Disaster Risk Management Act. It realized that FEMA National Flood Insurance Program is essentially bankrupt. It has right now $20 billion in the red. It's not working. It makes the wrong land use policies. It reinforces what we just heard. And therefore, Congress essentially embedded in it, even so it's not fully enforced, 3 times out. You have 3 times that FEMA will pay flooding. If you haven't done anything then, you are out. Now, it doesn't quite work that because it has to work in conjunction with the community's floodplain manager, which is in different places a different individual. It can be in a small community, the building inspector. In the city, I'm not sure who your floodplain manager is. Okay?
So I want to turn to some other questions.
But there will be an end, and as frequency of flooding goes up, as I try to make the point by numbers, insurance is not the solution.
Well, how long will that take? Adrian? Yeah.
Thanks very much. Adrian Benepe, formerly one of the bureaucrats, now on the nonprofit side. First, just a quick comment. I think 2 of you, and I think Rob Rogers, in that slide of the security protections on Wall Street, I would say that this is, we still do not fully understand the total impact of what has just happened here. It is beyond what we know, even in this room full of wise people. And I think that image is appropriate because I think this hurricane event was a game changer the way 9/11 was a game changer in so many aspects of our life we can't even imagine. That not nearly as many people died, but the property destruction was far more vast, and it will change forever how we spend our money, how we allocate our resources, how we build our cities. Just a point of information, in many cities across the country, and I think Howard alluded to this, FEMA money is used to buy out private property owners in floodplains and floodways. So in Nashville, in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, they take their rivers and they have adjusted the flood zones by 4 feet in elevation, and thus they've gone from 200 feet to 600 feet for their floodways. And within those floodways, they're spending $40 million a year in relatively small, low-density counties, buying out private property owners to create effectively flood zones, parkland, and these flood zones are turned into parkland. And I wonder to what extent you think maybe we just have to do that here. Do we really want to rebuild single-family homes that were built by mistake in floodplains in Staten Island and in Rockaway? I mean, we real estate speculators ran the roost and built buildings. And do we have to? It'll take a great deal of political courage, but is that something we need to do right away? I'd be curious, assuming that the major big infrastructure things may lie down the road, what are some of the things you say we should be doing right away in the next 6 months? Because we have had 2 hurricanes of great strength in a year. We dodged the bullet with Hurricane Irene because the wind subsided just as it came ashore, but it caused great devastation inland in New York State and Vermont. So what should we be doing right away? Because we probably can't afford to wait the 15 or 20 years it'll take to build a giant floodgate. But we need to be doing things right away, right now for the city. Otherwise, as someone else alluded, we lose, I think was Klaus Jacob, who said, the Goldman Sachs start to walk out of the city. And then we lose our tax base, and then all bets are off. I'd like to hear some, immediate, what's the immediate ideas? What are we doing immediately?
I agree.
I'd like to draw up, Adrian, thanks for, I always appreciate former commissioners asking the hard questions. But in all seriousness, I think one of the things that you mentioned is that we're still in the process of identifying exactly what happened. I think that process is going to be key to identifying what are the things, we know there are long-term issues that need to be addressed, but we also know there are short-term issues that need to be addressed. And identifying what the most direct and effective ways of addressing those short-term issues is going to be one of the quick orders of business for the city.
Okay, but Howard, that was a bureaucratic response. What about something like, make sure the subways do not flood as best you can, like installing those louvers and inflatable? What about saying Con Ed has to, put its transformers in waterproof boxes and, just do it?
I think those are all the things that
Yeah, but if there are short-term solutions, are they doable within 6 months or a year?
Can the mayor make a decree that Con Ed will build their transformers on 20-foot stilts, period?
I think, I'm just going to go, you like any problem, you go after the cheapest, easiest pieces with the most effect. So whether it's the balloons in the subway tunnels or actually individual building owners or individual homeowners taking certain precautions. You know, it's interesting, Ilya in the introduction said we lost power and communications in our office for a week, and that's kind of a bummer. You sort of end up like Rip Van Winkle, but you know, the reality was what really hurt was the loss of transportation, because you couldn't actually function with those 60 people that you need to deal with every day. And you know, and I would say if you have a choice of taking on the various pieces, you know, go after the transportation. I mean, that is number one. I think that was actually, in my personal opinion, more of an effect on the city than the areas of power loss in some ways, and a broader one.
Yeah.
I have to say something on that. Look, we have worked under the climate study funded by NYSERDA, by you, the ratepayers, when you pay your electricity and gas, for 3 years with the MTA. The knowledge was there. The engineers were in their start hole to do something. It never got before the board of directors, as far as I know, and therefore it never got to Albany, to the governor, and then the CEO that had the experience where Irene went over to Hong Kong, and new guy came in who had no idea what was going on. Started all over. So there are the institutional problems. When it comes to the political level, we have totally failed. On the engineering level, we would have been able to do something since the last 3 years, but, hold on, we have to convince the legislature to do something, because the MTA is not dependent on the mayor, it's not dependent on the CEO, right. Klaus, not on the governor.
I think we're coming around to this consensus.
Just very quick, the grates, the subway grates were done in less than 12 months.
Right. I mean,
less than 12
obviously
months.
It can be done.
So
it's there. Yeah.
Yes. During the storm, there were headlines and talk about there being a lack of affordable housing and 30 to 40,000 people. Where were they going to go? So I wanted to address this issue because I grew up in public housing in Coney Island and NYCHA housing. And so after the storm, I went back to see what I could do, and I was there last Sunday with the Red Cross. And I'm not going to get into the politics of this. I'm going to ask about the philosophy going forward and how the storm is going to impact how we view where and how affordable housing is happening throughout our city. Because when I go back frequently to my hood, and what I was surprised to see when I was there this past Sunday, that there were additional low-income housing being built, and that it has become a ghettoization of one block after another for about 20 blocks, starting from outside of Seagate all the way up to the 20s before the amusement area of affordable housing. And there's more of that construction happening. So my question to you, or you probably don't have the answer, of course, right at this moment, but my consideration to you is, how are we now going to start in this game changer that we've all talked about, the issues of how we approach affordable housing and how we're going to deal with this issue on an ongoing basis?
Ron, do you want to? Yeah. But you need a microphone.
I just want to, I was out in Coney Island the day before, actually with Cynthia, and I must say that for people to be fed in those buildings, they had to develop teams of people to climb 14 stories because there were people there who were infirmed and could not walk up and down. And so just to get water and food, they had to do that. We can begin, we have the technology, if we want to spend the money, to retrofit those buildings, to put the equivalent of an old, you know, what are they called, dumbwaiters going up and down, so we can bring food up there quickly. We have the ability to light the stairwells and not allow them to go dark at night. We have the ability to have those elevators run. running. And if we did what Klaus is saying and made sure that electricity was, put in waterproof containers or raised above the ground, then we wouldn't have to do any of the emergency measures. Then we could continue to get electricity in those buildings. These are forgotten people. And the one thing I really have to disagree with Howard, a lot of the housing built after 1985 in the Rockaways and in Coney Island, I saw people on the first floor carrying out their furniture the same way I saw people in New Orleans do it. We should never have allowed those houses to be built that low without being able to raise those buildings. Some of those, I believe, I'm not sure, are on slab on grade. The kinds of housing they've built, other than the public housing in the Rockaways, are really, all brand new. Or built within the last 10 years, and they should have never been allowed out there. And so our land use policies should prevent the development of those communities. When it comes to communities that exist, we have to remember that in addition to the physical issues, there are really strong psychological issues that deal with memory and place and other things. So we can't just erase those communities. So we have to be very sophisticated in the way we begin to move them and change them. And I think, the discussion today has been very, very good. I must say that, some of the city response, what city planning is doing and what OEM is doing has really been, to my mind, heartwarming to see the way people have come together and done things. But a lot of our policies really have to be thought through, including, we have to remember that it's Robert Moses who moved people to the Rockaways. He took them from Lincoln Center and he placed them in the Rockaways in what were bungalows there, and then eventually became the housing. So we really need to get a democratic process that allows for things to get done. The one model I would suggest is what Marilyn Gelber did to create the upstate watershed. And it was a concerted effort of the city of New York to buy the development rights up there. And it's, I think you mentioned that a little bit earlier. But I think we've got to start looking at that.
So another question?
I might take a chairperson's prerogative and make some closing comments. Because the first of my closing comments is that on Saturday late afternoon, there's going to be a meeting of all of the deans of the regional schools, the deans who are in charge of the education of all the architectural students that get educated in the region. And it is certainly my hope, and I know it's part of the plan, to have this conversation continue late Saturday afternoon. And for those who are interested in another facet of what all of this is, I would invite you to come by. I would certainly hope that students from the area would come by and see what plans are afoot to have the schools do not the necessarily first or second responder, but what's the research that the institutions in the region can bring to bear to try and address this, not immediately, but at all. I myself am astounded by, the turnout and the attention given to this. I don't think I can think of something that's brought so much attention to bear in the papers. I don't think I can think of another major city in the world that has suffered this much, major city, global city, save the Second World War. This extent of disaster. This is going to require an enormous act of will. It won't be an act of money. It won't be an act of politics. It'll be an act of national will to change the culture to address what is an obviously changing climate that there's been a lot of denial about, and to do it, as has been discussed, equitably and appropriately and economically and compassionately. And I think compassionately is probably the most important word. And with that, I want to thank you all for your enormous compassion, where you have given $2,350 to the mayor's fund. And the only thing I can say is there are cards on the seat. Give more. That's my closing comment.